And can you see my face there on top of the presentation?
Come again?
Yes.
Can you see my face on top of
Yes.
the presentation? Okay, thanks. Good day, everyone. Thank you for being here. Let's keep 1 minute more for people that still arriving to the presentation. Okay, it seems like we have a good number of people already arriving. Welcome all to our Marine Biodiversity Networking Friday. Thank you for being here. Our topic today is mangrove diversity, many or distinct. My name is Digna Rueda Roa, and I work as a research scientist at the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida. I'm the shorty one in the photo. I have a master's degree in marine biology from the Universidad de Oriente in Venezuela, and a doctorate in biological oceanography from the University of South Florida. I have over 20 years of experience using satellite remote sensing to study oceanographic and biological processes. Currently, I'm working on a project using high-resolution satellite imagery to produce time series of mangrove coverage in Florida and Puerto Rico. This project is called the Mangrove Coast Collaborative, has taught me so much about the many ecosystem services that mangroves provide. And that's why it's truly a privilege to moderate today's discussion on mangrove biodiversity. So let me introduce to our speaker, someone who has taken a truly fascinating journey through the world of ecology, Dr. Martin Simmers. Dr. Simmers' research career began in terrestrial and soil ecology. He has worked also in evolutionary ecology, in terrestrial animal ecology, but the pull of coastal ecosystem was too irresistible for him. As the millennium started, he shifted his focus to coastal and intertidal ecosystems, starting with sandy and rocky shores before he immersed himself in the lush, complex world of mangrove forests, a scientific home he has continued to build ever since. For over a decade, Dr. Zimmer has led the Mangrove Ecology Group at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen, Germany. His work investigates how mangrove communities shape ecosystem processes and how these processes translate into vital ecosystem services, from coastal protection to the important blue carbon storage. Dr. Zimmer is concerned with ecosystem processes and services in mangroves, how these depend on mangrove communities, and how they can be maintained worldwide through sustainable use and protection of mangroves. His research reminds us that mangroves are more than just beautiful. They are essential to the health of our planet and its people. Dr. Zimmer is also a member of the Mangrove Specialist Group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and working also with the Global Mangrove Alliance and the World Mangrove Center. This to ensure that his research directly informs conservation and restoration efforts. What is especially inspiring is his dedication to understanding how biodiversity drives ecosystem processes. Today, he will challenge us to think about mangrove biodiversity and why this matters for conservation and restoration efforts. But before we delve into Martin's talk, the Marine Biodiversity Network team graciously allowed me a few minutes to share some highlights from the Mangrove Coast Collaborative project where I have been working. This project is a collaboration between researchers and two national exploring research reserves, Rockery Bay in Florida and Hobo's Bay in Puerto Rico. Everything started in 2017 when two strong hurricanes passed over both reserves, affecting very strongly the mangrove forest. The goal of this project was to understand how storms affect mangroves and how the recuperation of the mangrove forest after storms. For this short talk, I'm going to concentrate on Rockery Bay Reserve. Hurricane Irma slammed the reserve as a Category 3 hurricane, and the effects on the mangrove forest were dramatic. So let's see before the storm. These images that you have here are for the beginning of 2017. At the left, you have historical Google Earth Pro image, which is a very high resolution at that maybe 30 centimeters resolution. And at the right, you have the annual coverage map we generated. We use worldview satellite imagery, which has 8 bands and 2 meter resolution, and we made annual land cover classification maps that we generated using indices between the different spectral bands and decision tree algorithms. And the stakeholders, especially the from each reserve, guide us to refine the map. See here how I put the mangrove in pink? I just want them to really show up in the map. And look how big are the areas covered with the mangrove forest in this region. Now let's see after Hurricane Irma. So these images are from the beginning of 2018. The historical Google image at the left show how the area looks brownish, grayish, and the map show like if it were naked soil. The person on Rockery Bay informed us that after the storm, the damage varied from the mangrove losing all their leaves all the way to be completely torn. A leaf that has not, a tree that has no leaves, you can see through and see the bottom. So that's what exactly is looking, the map is looking at the soil underneath the trees. So now we are going to compare the before and the after storm map. For this, we took only the mangrove class for those annual maps of 2017 and 2018, and we subtracted them. This to assess the spread of the storm damage. So we are going to concentrate in the area of more damage in the southern Rockery Bay. And the damage, you see it as red, which is, we call it canopy loss, because we are not sure what type of damage it is. So let's look again to this image, a zoom of this image, and compare with Google Earth satellite image, and you can see how what is red is where you cannot see greenery in the Google image. So this map allows to measure the extension of the damage, how many square kilometers were damaged by the storm. However, the next step was, very important for the project, was to assess the recuperation of the mangrove forest. So we did that by doing the difference between the annual map of 2020 subtracting 2018. We didn't do 2019 because there weren't good images to create a map. So we can see that by 2020, nearly everything is blue. So it's what we call canopy gain. That means that most of the loss of the mangrove in 2017 due to the storm was mainly due to canopy loss. And in 2020, it has been recuperated, most of it. So the next step was to assess if mangrove forest was actually lost. And we did that by subtracting 2020 from 2017. And we can see that in some very specific, small but very specific areas, there hasn't been recuperation of the mangrove. So that points out to actual loss of mangrove coverage. That type of map helps the managers and the project to focus their attention on those areas to understand the reason for the mangrove loss. One reason was due to the mangroves were completely damaged. And you know, the little mangroves growing there, they weren't enough to be seen. So it was an area where mangrove was damaged. However, the most common reason, at least in this region, it was because the hydrographic conditions of those areas changing in a way that it didn't support mangrove health or growth anymore. That type of map will eventually help guide efforts for mangrove recuperation in Rockery Bay. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share these few insights from our results. Now, coming back to our talk today about mangrove biodiversity, many or distinct. This seminar will showcase some aspects of mangrove biodiversity worldwide, and its relationship with their ecosystem properties, processes, and services, as well as some measures of mangrove conservation and re-establishment. Dr. Zimmer will challenge us to think about mangrove biodiversity, whether it is truly abundant or uniquely distinct, and why this matters for conservation and restoration efforts around the globe. Please join, please join me in welcoming Dr. Martin Zimmer, a scientist who is not just protecting mangroves, but ensuring they thrive for generations to come. Let's give him a one round of virtual applauses. So I'm going to stop sharing my presentation, and I will give the floor to Martin, if I can see how to stop. One moment. Okay, I think I stopped.
Thank you very much, Digna, for this very nice introduction. And thanks a lot also for giving some insight into your mangrove project in Rockery Bay. Great thank you also goes to Joanna and Frank for having invited me to give this seminar today. And it's a great pleasure for me to take you into mangrove biodiversity and scratch the surface, actually only a bit of this topic. Because I think it's a very important topic, but it's highly related to many other issues when it comes to mangrove ecology. So let's start with the bad news, which is not really news anymore, because in the end, we all know it already. When we talk about biodiversity, then we have to face the fact that we are currently in a phase of drastic biodiversity loss worldwide in essentially all ecosystems. And this biodiversity crisis doesn't come alone. It comes together with at least 2 or 3 other major crises to humankind. Climate change, pollution, pandemics might be rising. And these challenges or crises, as I said, don't come alone, but they interact with each other and cause each other in a way. So we certainly reached the stage where it's not enough to wash our hands well and all will be well. The good news is there might be solutions to these challenges, and one that has been repeatedly and increasingly being put forward is nature-based solutions. That means we can address societal challenges by sustainably managing natural or modified ecosystems, and a very important and central part to these nature-based solutions is biodiversity. Biodiversity as a driver of ecosystem processes that translate into ecosystem services and help us solve these challenges. One of these challenges, again, climate change, needs attention in terms of climate change mitigation, and there nature-based solutions have been proposed a lot recently, especially in the term or with the term of blue carbon, so carbon sequestration and storage in marine and coastal ecosystems. And the reason for that is kind of summarized here in that graph, because these ecosystems store huge amounts of carbon in their biomass, but mostly in their sediment, in the underground, both biomass and organic matter. And this stock of carbon is potentially stable over centuries, if not millennia. And why is that? Where does it come from? Well, first of all, of course, we have plants, we have trees in mangroves that sequester CO2, extracting it from the atmosphere and turning it into their biomass. But then this biomass dies off at some point. In the case of mangroves, it's the leaves that fall to the ground, like with all other trees that we know of. And in the case of mangroves growing in the intertidal between land and sea, there's also quite some input of organic matter, blades of seagrasses, macroalgal tissues, and so on and so forth that are drifted with the tides into the mangroves, entangled in the root system, very complex three-dimensional root system, and being buried in the ground, in the sediment, by sedimentation and by animal activity. This is what we then refer to as storage. Now, because of a high saline level and anoxic conditions, this organic matter in the sediment of mangroves is stored, is very stable and stored over a long time because there's very little, very slow decay and degradation and very little CO2 release. So again, we have sequestration, storage, and we have to distinguish between biomass and sediment here. And we have to take into account that there are several drivers of the biomass in these mangrove forests. This is first of all, of course, the stand age. The older mangrove forest is, the more biomass accumulates. There are stand characteristics, tree density, tree size, and so on and so forth. There's the species composition and the identity of the species as summarized in this table and in this graph as one example out of many. When we look at the table, we see that in a study in the Segara Anakan in Indonesia, there was a variation by factor 100 between the least carbon storage in the above ground biomass and the highest storage or stock in the above ground biomass. And in the graph on the right, we see that different species of mangroves have different carbon fractions in their wood, which also then, of course, adds up to the species-specific differences in carbon storage in the above ground biomass. When we look at the sediment, it is interesting that different species here in a global comparison, so different species of several genera, show very similar burial rates of carbon, maybe except of the genus Candelia, but the others are essentially the same. But at the same time, we see that the species on the right-hand graph very clearly determine and drive the carbon stocks in the sediment. Interestingly, in a global meta-analysis, we found out that the stand age does not predictably drive the carbon stocks in the sediment, but the species do. So we have species-specific effects here. Now let's take a step back and look at these different species and this different stand specificities of mangroves. Let's go on a little trip around the world, starting in northern Brazil, one of the most luscious mangroves I have ever seen, a beautiful forest, very dense, tall growing trees, 30, 35 meters high, but only relatively low species number 3 to maximum 5 mangrove species in these forests. The same when we go to the Caribbean, a Colombian island in the middle of the Caribbean, also beautiful, very luscious, 3 species only. In a semi-arid region of Mexico, in the Baja California, we have only 3 species of mangroves here growing directly next to desert vegetation. On the other side of the Atlantic, Senegal, also only 3, maybe 4 species of mangroves under also semi-arid conditions. On the other side of Africa, South Africa, East Coast, very southern tip, again, only 3 species. By the way, totally different set of species. And then we go to Southeast Asia, here Malaysia, where we find 10, 15 species of mangroves in a given spot, in a given mangrove forest. Even more so in Singapore, where we find even more than 20 different mangrove species on a very small space, because the mangroves in Singapore are really tiny. Further in the South Pacific, Fiji, still 8 to, well, maybe a bit less, but up to 8 species. And then in the very southern distribution limit near Melbourne in Australia, there's only 1 species left that can cope with the climatic conditions very close to the distribution limit. And the same is true for the northern distribution limit in Florida or in China, for instance. And this summarizes into this kind of world map where we very clearly see a global pattern of the Atlantic East Pacific, the AEP, with overall less than 15 species, and with the Indo-West Pacific, the IWP, with, depending on what we define a mangrove, more than 60 species. And we see a very clearly pattern or patch of high species richness in the area around Indonesia all the way to Papua New Guinea. And this, again, is just a different presentation of the same information. Many species in the eastern mangroves, very few species in the western mangroves. And why is that, and why is it so stable over time? Historically, the reason for that begins some 65 million years ago in, back then, the Tethys Ocean, which nowadays would be the Mediterranean, where the ancestors of the current of the extant mangroves kind of started colonizing the coastline and the intertidal coming from the terrestrial. And we have some representatives of the extant genera Laguncularia, Conocarpus, Rhizophora, Avicennia on the western coast of the Tethys Ocean. And we have some other, many other species or precursors of today's species on the eastern coast. Then the Tethys closed, and these species migrated to the west, southwest, and east and southeast. And in the ongoing times, about 20 million years ago, the Tethys closed, and there was no way of exchange anymore between these eastern realms and the western realms. And by this, the species evolved in their different areas, and they are still very clearly separate from each other. As you can see in the map of the present, we still have this very clear separation of the eastern mangroves and the western mangroves. And that results in that, in fact, except for a handful of species that have been introduced from the AEP into the IWP and vice versa, naturally speaking, there is only 1 mangrove species, and that's a fern that is common all over the world. All the others are either western or eastern. And this is shown in this map where we very clearly see the different drivers of geographical barriers of mangroves, the vast distance between the South Pacific and the west coast of the Americas, for instance, or the temperature limit on the southern tip of Africa, where these 2 realms of mangroves would get in touch but cannot pass and cannot survive. So we have these distinct realms of mangroves, high diversity in the IWP, low diversity in the AEP. But how about the fauna in mangroves? Very rich, for sure. And the interesting thing is we have both marine and terrestrial faunas in the mangroves. We see many different and very dense fish populations and communities in the mangrove roots at high water. We have semi-terrestrial and semi-marine species like mud skippers. We have the horseshoe crabs coming into the mangroves for reproduction, and of course many jellyfish like the mangrove jellyfish here. On the terrestrial side, many diverse vertebrates and mammals, and maybe one of them, the most enigmatic one, the royal Bengal tiger in the Bangladesh Sundarbans, where they are very threatened by extinction, but they are really enigmatic animals for these mangroves. We have dozens, hundreds of different bird species that migrate through mangroves, that roost there, that rest there, and find their food and breed there. And of course, invertebrates. Ants and termites, as shown here, for instance. We don't know, they're very rich, very diverse, but we don't really know what they do in the mangroves. What is their ecological interaction with other organisms there, except for maybe that they seem to be involved in pollination of flowering mangrove species. Here in Texas, on the left side, in Australia on the right side, ants visiting flowers, obviously for the nectars, and very likely also being involved in pollination of these flowers of mangroves. Something hardly studied at all. We don't understand what's going on. Certainly a field of investigation. And of course, plants are always visited and used by herbivores. Just some examples here from different places in the world, and the result is damaged leaves in various ways in all places over the world. Again, some mangrove species respond stronger or have stronger damages than others. And again, a relationship between herbivores and mangroves that is not well understood. Of course, these herbivores have animals, predators, enemies, predators that feed on them. And then let's go to the ground, to the benthic environment, where we find numerous snails in very high density, and of course, probably the most diverse faunal element of mangroves, crabs and other crustaceans living there in high diversity, playing a very important role in ecosystem processes, like, for instance, climate change mitigation, because they are involved in carbon storage in mangrove sediments. They build burrows, they pull the leaves of the mangroves into the ground, they bury them in the sediment and contribute to the long-term storage of organic matter, particulate organic matter, in the mangrove sediments. But there's much more than that we have to consider. For instance, when we look again at this graph, then we see these huge amounts of carbon in the sediments. But we have to, and it comes to immediately to our mind that, of course, we have to protect these mangroves. And that's true, we have to protect them. But we have to keep in mind that when we protect mangrove forests all over the world, then in the end, in terms of climate change mitigation, this is only emissions reduction. Because if we didn't protect them, if we lost them, we would release huge amounts of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. If we really want to add to the carbon dioxide removal, which is so urgently needed for climate change mitigation, if we want to reach additionality of mangrove forests, then we, on top of conserving them, of protecting them, we need to re-establish them. We need to afforest mangrove forests wherever possible. But beyond mitigation, there's a lot more. Blue carbon is one of the many ecosystem services, but biodiversity, this is why we're here today, is another one. They provide numerous natural resources that contribute to the livelihood and well-being of local communities on the tropical coasts. And certainly, last but not least, coastal protection is a very important aspect here. And this goes in the direction of climate change adaptation then. We know, and probably you all know, how well mangroves are suited for protecting coasts, tropical coasts, from storm surges, even from tsunamis and from erosion. They stabilize the coastlines by slowing down wave action, by reducing the wave height significantly over very short distances through their very complex three-dimensional root structure. And the important point, and this is where it comes to resilience and real adaptation, is that even with increasing sea level, with sea level rise, we are very optimistic and very certain that mangroves still will do that job, because through sedimentation rates, high sedimentation rates, and vertical sediment accretion rates, mangroves grow vertically, and they can, if there is enough sediment supply, they can keep pace with sea level rise. So mangroves grow vertically while sea level rises, which means that if we let them do their job, they will also and still protect coasts from storm surges and from erosion in the future, even with sea level rise, if there is enough space for them to grow vertically and to move landward while the sea level rises. The reason for that is, I had stressed it already shortly or summarized it very shortly. The reason for that is the multiple factors from land and from the sea that add to the sediment deposition in the mangrove forests, and to the also the autochthonous processes, the autochthonous sources of organic matter that stays in the mangroves because of the complex structure of the roots and adds to the net surface elevation of the sediment. So it's a very complex interplay of different actors, marine, terrestrial, and the mangroves themselves, that in the end lead to this surface elevation. The interesting thing is that here we also find an effect of first stand age, and second, and most important for us today, the species. What you can see in that graph is different dates, so kind of stand age over 2 years, or a bit more than 2 years, from June 2017 to December 2019, and the comparison of different mangrove species, stands of different mangrove species. So very young on the left, a bit older, 2 years older on the right, and the 3 different species compared to the bare sediment here. And you see that over time, with growing stand age, the surface vertical accretion here on the y-axis increases. And at the same time, we see that also the differences between these different mangrove species increase. So we have a clear species-specific surface elevation effect, as much as we saw for the carbon sequestration or the carbon storage effect before. And let's just stick to these 2 examples where diversity of mangrove species play a very important role in driving ecosystem services. But let's get back to this map and to this information that we saw before. We have the very high species richness in Southeast Asia, specifically, or maybe mostly as an example in this area that I encircled here with this blue rectangular. And then compared to that, a very low species richness of mangroves in Central America in both cases. What does it mean? When we compare this map with another map that has been published shortly after, but still already more than 10 years ago, and we look at the above ground biomass of mangroves in the blue rectangular in Southeast Asia and the blue rectangular in Central America, and we assume that the above ground biomass as a status, as a property of a mangrove forest, is a direct proxy for productivity of this forest, then we see that despite the huge difference in species number, the productivity of the Central American mangroves does not really seem to differ significantly or drastically from the productivity in Southeast Asia. That is kind of unexpected, because we would have expected, and this is what we often learn and read in textbooks, that biodiversity drives ecosystem processes, and the higher the diversity, the more productive, for instance, an ecosystem like a mangrove forest would be. Our explanation, or our attempt to explain that, is based on functional traits of mangroves. In a comprehensive analysis of different, I think more than 30, almost 40 different traits, functional traits of mangrove trees from all over the world, we realized that the two major species in the Atlantic East Pacific mangrove forests, Avicennia germinans above and Rhizophora mangler below with the red circles, are on a trait basis very different from each other. They're almost as different from each other as the many, or even more different, as the many different mangrove species that we find in Southeast Asia. And we believe that these functional distinctiveness is the driver of productivity and other ecosystem services probably in or processes in the AEP compared to the IWP. And we delved a bit deeper in that comparison in a mangrove forest study in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh. And we found that when we look at carbon storage in the above ground biomass, in the below ground biomass, in the sediment, then we see that for the sediment organic carbon, species richness of the mangrove stand is a significant driver, but the functional composition, or as we call it, functional distinctiveness of the species, is an even more important driver. And when it comes to above or below ground biomass, species richness is not significant, while functional distinctiveness is a significant determinant. And the same is true for other ecosystem processes and properties, for instance, productivity and sediment nutrients. So we see here that the more different mangrove species are from each other, the more or the better they drive ecosystem processes, while species richness itself is probably not as important. So it's a different type of biodiversity that we're talking about here. And that brings me to changing a perspective, or maybe just building up a perspective on how we should manage and govern ecosystems, or we maybe want to govern and manage ecosystems. This is a timeline over mangrove management over the last kind of century, or a bit less than that, with a very clear tendency from first helping nature support people, which is very clearly anthropocentric. It was all about what is the use and the value that we could take out of mangroves, to more ecocentric perspectives with a low intervention level of putting nature first. It's all about nature, let nature be nature. And then a higher intervention level, bringing nature back. And this graph shows kind of a movement towards ecological engineering, maybe a future movement towards an even more anthropocentric perspective and a high intervention level, which is called ecosystem co-design, building with nature, using nature to help us adapt to the forthcoming and upcoming changes, global changes, climate change driven, sea level rise, warming, and so on and so forth. So what is this ecosystem co-design? In comparison to classical ecosystem restoration, that is focused on the ecosystem structure, on the biodiversity in that ecosystem, and ecosystem restoration tries to get back to a stage of ecosystem structure and biodiversity that is as similar as possible to the stage that we found, the status that we had before degradation. In comparison to that, ecosystem co-design focuses on human needs, on ecosystem services. So biodiversity can be an aim, but need not necessarily be an aim. And biodiversity can then mean species richness or functional diversity or functional distinctiveness. But the major point is, what are the species that drive those ecosystem services that are mostly needed, that are most urgently and most dearly needed in a local setting by humans? What are the species that drive these ecosystem services most efficiently? And these are the species, or the set of species in interaction with each other, that we would re-establish in a given area in order to reach or to obtain ecosystem services that are needed by local populations, by local people. So it's a different approach that need not necessarily be contradictory, but the aim is different. And in some cases, it ends up in the same aim because biodiversity is also relevant for ecosystem co-design, but maybe less so in terms of species number or species richness, but rather in terms of how different, how distinct are species that we can combine to reach the aim of providing ecosystem services. So again, all this goes beyond ecosystem, climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation in a way that we need to take into account all these different aspects, these different services to reach coastal resilience, to reach the resilience of coastal socio-ecological systems against climate change effects, against sea level rise and land use change, and whatever change we as humans may have caused and will cause to these ecosystems. And this brings up the very important point that we're not only talking about the ecosystem themselves, and again, this also enlightens the concept of ecosystem co-design, but we have to take into account different dimensions of governance and management of these coastal ecosystems. There are at least these 5: political, economical, ethical, legal, and social. And this kind of distinguishes between what we call desirability on the social and societal part, what is it that people want, and the feasibility, like what can be done politically, economically, or legally. The desirability versus feasibility here in these dimensions of governance and management. Always keeping in mind, what is it that local people, local communities mostly need from these ecosystems? And that leads me to actually my last slide, where I just summarize the importance of interaction and of co-design in managing biodiversity, not only in mangrove forests, but probably in other coastal and even non-coastal ecosystems, and in managing the ecosystem services that are driven by the mangrove communities, by their taxonomic or functional diversity and distinctiveness. So we need to take into account the needs of people, the needs of local stakeholders. We need to involve them in all the governance and management steps, from planning to implementation and to monitoring. In this case, showcased by mangrove re-establishment measures and activities. But it's the same for all other governance and management activities that we have in mind and that we need to do. Take this anthropocentric perspective and involve local stakeholders, involve local communities in the co-design from the very first step through the whole project, through the whole governance and management, to the monitoring how successful these measures are or were that we were taking. And with this, I hope I can provoke some controversial discussion, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Martin. That was a very interesting presentation. And so far we have 3 questions for you. Let me read the first one. It's from Paul Adkin Teteri. I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. How can you quantify the amount of CO2 mangroves capture from the atmosphere? And what's the process of carbon trade?
Yeah, that's a very, very good and important, at the same time, difficult question. So thanks, Paul, for that. So the amount of CO2 that mangroves capture from the atmosphere is measured indirectly by measuring the increase in mangrove biomass, by their growth and by the sequestration or storage into the mangrove into the biomass of mangroves. We don't really measure the amount of CO2, but of course we can calculate or at least estimate the amount of CO2. And there are some numbers around there, but the important thing is that they are regionally very different and that they also a lot depend on the mangrove species that we look at. So it's not a global value that we can kind of put forward. It depends on many circumstances. And the process of carbon trade, yeah, that's a very controversial topic, and I don't think we have the time to really get into that here. Just very briefly, the point here is that we have to take into account in the end, emission reduction, where we protect mangroves and avoid the emission of greenhouse gases. And that can be traded if you can quantify that, which is difficult per se. And on the other hand, the increase that we get by increasing the area of mangroves through reestablishment. And in all cases, nowadays, it's mostly based on estimates and models. And what we really need and what we are really, really trying to push forward is that we get more into the direction of actually measuring the increase in biomass and measuring the increase in sediment, organic carbon, organic matter, rather than just estimating it. Anything beyond that would take way too long here, so I'm happy to get in exchange with you by email or whatever, but I don't think I can answer that here.
We have another question from Timo Heidinger. What are your recommendations when it comes to assessing the extent and AGV of mangroves on a regional scale, more specifically with remote sensing methods?
Right. Okay, thanks, Timo. Yeah, I mean, remote sensing methods are increasingly being used because when you want to assess the above ground biomass of mangroves, then I mean the most straightforward way would be to cut down the tree and weigh it. But of course, we don't want to do that. That would be counterintuitive and counterproductive. So there is ways of in the field measuring what we call the DBH, the diameter at breast height. This in combination with the height of the tree, and this is very important, knowing the tree species that we are talking about and knowing the region that we are talking about. We use so-called allometric equations, where we use the DBH and the height to estimate mathematically the biomass and then the carbon content in this tree. But as I said before, it's very important to do this species specifically because different mangrove species differ significantly and drastically in this. And also regionally, because the same mangrove species like Avicennia germinans in Mexico that I showed you in that photo are totally different than from Brazil. So we need to take this into account. Now, when it comes to remote sensing method, it gets even a bit more complicated because then the information that we get, I mean, that's the idea of remote sensing. We don't go to the field. We do it from our desktop in a way. But that means that there's a risk of error that is increasing compared to the direct measurements. Estimating the height of a tree, depending on the methodology that you use with remote sensing, is relatively straightforward. But from this, estimating the biomass of the tree is much more complicated and needs much more, I don't like the term, but much more ground truthing, much more reference points that you can really use. So we would assume that it's less accurate, but we just recently did a literature analysis for Indonesia, where surprisingly the values that we get from remote sensing are lower than the field data, but in the end not so different from what we would have expected from global estimates for this area. There's still a lot, meaning that there is still a lot to do, but I think we are on a good way and we are on a very good development to be able to use remote sensing methods for, at least for the above ground biomass. It's so far totally impossible to use that for below ground biomass or even sediment organic matter.
Okay, we have like 12 minutes more for questions. We have few more questions. The next one is for Tyler Murray. Is there a database of standards available for connecting species to functional traits? I am curious to see the concept of functional distinctiveness applied to other ecosystems.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. So simple answer is there are several databases out there of functional traits of plant, but, and that's a big however, mangroves are not really represented in these data, or very underrepresented in these databases. We did this analysis a couple of years ago and it was really not easy to get the information from the literature. And this is part of, or this is one of the reasons why now a colleague of mine at ZMT, Veronique Helfer, is trying to get functional traits of mangroves into a single database and then open for use, of course, for everybody to actually develop this concept of functional distinctiveness a bit further for mangroves and potentially also other species. So we are still in a stage of infancy. There's a lot to do, but there's growing databases and growing information available for the link between mangrove species and functional traits, and even more so mangrove species and geographical or spatial resolution, because the same tree or the same species still show or exhibit different functional traits in different regions of the world.
We have a question from Karya Maharya, and Martin, I recommend you can see it because it's a little long. I'm
Yes.
still going to read it. Isn't the co-design and restoration paradigm psychologically actually contradictory, situated at the end of opposite spectrums? For instance, environmental psychology research has often observed that perceived biodiversity actually better predicts psychological restoration. For example, mental function and health, rather than non-statistical significant objective biodiversity of sites experienced by people. So how should we reconcile or decide which paradigm, co-design versus restoration, best fit the sustainable continuation of life?
Yeah. Thanks, Karya. That's actually a brilliant question. And it's a very important one as well. Let me start by saying that the concept of ecosystem co-design we don't want to contradict classical restoration, and we certainly do not want to contradict conservation of ecosystems where there is still something to be conserved. The outcome of ecosystem co-design would be a mosaic of different approaches to protecting or reestablishing natural ecosystems. And what you stress here is one out of many ecosystem services that these ecosystems have. And this goes to mental functioning and health, mental health. And if we come to the conclusion that high biodiversity, high species richness is a driver of this ecosystem service, which seems to be the case, and this ecosystem service is what we want to get in a certain place, then yes, certainly go for as many species as possible. But in other cases, at least as important, if not more important, are other ecosystem services. For instance, coastal protection. And when you look at the data that different species are differently efficient and effective in protecting the coasts, then the very provocative question is, if I have one species that is very efficient and I can plant them along a coastline to protect the coast from erosion, why would I dilute this coastal protection effect by planting other species that are less efficient in between? So, as I said, the outcome of all this would be a mosaic of different approaches, different biodiversity, rich or less rich spots in a given area that altogether would provide essentially all the ecosystem services, but in a given spot, they would focus on either this or the other ecosystem service. So I don't necessarily see a conflict here. Or if there is a conflict, we can resolve it.
So we have 4 questions left. Let's see what we can answer live. Carlos Jimenez says, hello, great talk. What functional trait, distinctiveness, do you consider the most important when considering coastal management and long-term monitoring?
Thanks, Carlos. I think I cannot answer that question because as I tried to say before, it all depends on what is the aim of the management. What is it that we want to get from these ecosystems? If it's mostly natural ecosystems, then the functional traits, we should not actually even think about that, because then it's really species richness. But when it comes to specific particular ecosystem services among those that I mentioned or others, then it would depend on this ecosystem service which functional traits are the most efficient drivers. So it's very specific, and there is no general or no overall answer to that.
Okay, the next question from Marie-Louise Crotter. Is coastal squeezing a big problem for mangroves in general, or is it there space enough in the tropics? It is a big problem for coastal marsh, which are present when mangrove is not.
Yes, thank you, Marie. It is. It is a very important aspect when it comes to sea level rise, because theoretically we believe and models predict or forecast that mangroves could keep pace and kind of just grow more inland and vertically, as I had shown you. But in the tropics, as almost everywhere in the world, in many places, there is this coastal squeeze. There is infrastructure, there are roads, there are settlements, or the topography of the coast just does not allow mangroves to move towards land. So yes, very short answer, it is a big problem.
Frank Mueller-Carter. Martin, the World Meteorological Organization is now designing a global greenhouse gas watch program, G3W. They seek to model fluxes and understand sources and sinks. What do you recommend for nations to focus on if we manage to highlight mangroves and other coastal wetlands in such a G3W for operational observing? What are your recommendations for data to move to databases like OBIS? How should these databases prepare to create such data?
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Very complex, but I did not expect anything else from you. I think the first step would be to really look into the species specificity of these different processes, like greenhouse gas capture or greenhouse gas release, which depends a lot on the environmental conditions, on the status of the mangroves or of the ecosystem in general. And as I said, or try to show also on the species. So I think for databases like OBIS, besides the biodiversity information and the information on the spatial distribution, it would be very interesting to add, and maybe this is being done already. If so, excuse me, but it would be very relevant and helpful to add information about very specific information about how different species contribute to different ecosystem processes like greenhouse gas capture and greenhouse gas release. And ideally, even so, with the different geographical information in the back, not only this species does it like this, but also in Florida, it does it like this, but in Brazil, it does it like that, something like this. And I think this would help a lot to even improve databases like OBIS and make them more useful for initiatives like the G3W.
Maybe we have time for the two questions left. Golarinwa Balogun asking, classifying mangrove into different types also presuppose they have different abilities for sequestering atmospheric carbon. Is this true in the case of difference in mangroves?
Yes, thank you, Bolarinwa. It is true for mangroves. We know that species differ in their sequestration capacity, and we know that on top of that, the environmental conditions play a big role. But species differ. The point is, we do not yet have enough data for enough different species in enough different places to really come to any concrete conclusion here. But I think we are on a way. People are looking into that more and more. And I'm positive that in the next couple of days, we will have data and databases, maybe even in OBIS, to have this information at hand for others. So there is differences. We still need to quantify them.
And I just rushed Wally. We go to your question. How do we set a boundary for mangrove or mudflats to minimize encroachment of mangrove or marshes? How should we protect all the coastal habitats so that one does not hamper another one?
Yeah, thanks, Ayush. I think if we want to set boundaries, then we need to take a very high intervention level, because these boundaries are fluid and they are drifting right now because of climate change. We see that in salt marshes versus mangroves in different places in the world, encroaching each other depending on the conditions. And we might say, well, that's fine. That's how it develops. But if we want to keep the boundaries as they are right now, if there are any boundaries at all, then we need to get active and to prevent the different ecosystems from expanding. As I said, I'm not sure this is what we want, but if we want that, I think this can only be done by very, very high intervention. That might be some levels of geoengineering. And again, I'm not sure this is what we want, because otherwise I would not really know how to interfere there. So I'm afraid my answer is not very satisfactory to you, but it's either very high level of intervention or we can't do it.
Well, thank you everybody for being with us in this Marine Biodiversity Networking Friday. We have one more question, but we don't have time to answer it. I don't know if we can answer online. I'm not sure. Thank you, everybody. I hope that you can make other Marine Biodiversity Networking Fridays. This was very, very interesting for us. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Digna.
Thank you very much. It was a great session.
Martin.
It was a lot of fun.